former U.S. ambassador to Syria is Robert Ford. He's joining us now from New Haven. He resigned from his post 2.5 years ago, saying he could no longer, quote, defend American policy in Syria. He's now a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. Welcome to the Al Jazeera News Hour, sir. What's your take on where the United States and Russia and Turkey are as of today inside Syria?
There are still big disagreements between the three countries. Turkey and Russia have improved their dialogue. They now have an open channel, but they still disagree about what a settlement in Syria should look like. That's why there's still a lot of fighting in Aleppo, because Turkey is helping Syrian rebels in Aleppo, and of course the Russians are helping the Syrian government. Meanwhile, Turkey does not agree with the United States about the role of Syrian Kurds, and in particular, Turkey and the United States do not agree about the dangers that Syrian Kurds could present to Turkish territorial integrity, given the close links between Syrian Kurds and Turkish Kurds.
Given the events of the intervening 2.5 years between your decision to tender your resignation and, as I say again, where we are today, what's gone wrong or what's gone right in the intervening years and months?
American policy really has not changed in the last 3.5 years. There's been very little change in American policy. The United States government is still hoping that Russia will pressure, that Russia will deliver the Syrian government to accept ceasefires, to allow humanitarian convoys to go through, that the Russians will prevent the Syrians from using chemical weapons, from targeting civilians. There's a long list of American government asks to Russia, and none of those asks, zero, have received a favorable response from Moscow. Your correspondent from the UN was just talking about the Russian reaction to the United Nations investigative team finding that the Syrian government used chlorine gas on at least 3 occasions in Syria after there was a Security Council resolution in which specifically Syria was not to use chemical weapons, and specifically the UN Security Council said it would consider Chapter 7 sanctions if Syria again did use chemical weapons. The Russians have walked back from that.
But you're saying, just to interrupt you just for a second,
really
Mr. Ambassador, because as ever time is short, you're saying US policy hasn't changed. I'm assuming as well you might want to say Russian policy hasn't changed, but just last week we were hearing from Staffan de Mistura and also Jan Egeland at the UN headquarters in Geneva saying, look, the Russians were front and center when it comes to getting the aid into the besieged areas. They were the first country to say, yes, we will do what we have to do. And everyone knew when they made that announcement, 2 things were happening. 1, Sergei Lavrov was talking to Damascus, and 2, Sergei Lavrov was talking to the US Secretary of State John Kerry, we assumed, to make sure that the US was on board and that aid mechanism could begin at some point.
Yes, but you will also recall that Staffan de Mistura, as recently as last week, said that there were no aid deliveries during the month of August. The Russian responsibility in this process, as the Americans see it, is the Russian responsibility is to deliver Syrian government cooperation with the delivery of humanitarian aid. It's not happening. That could be because the Russians don't have the intention of pressuring the Syrian government. The Russians maybe are not credible when they promise, or it could be that the Russians themselves don't have the influence in Damascus to make the Syrian government allow aid convoys to go through. In any case, the Russians have not delivered Syrian acquiescence to aid convoys, and the American policy, depending on the Russians, frankly, is going nowhere.
I'm intrigued as to know why you say the Russians don't have the influence that the Americans, I guess, might expect or demand them to have. I mean, what has to change here for where this conflict goes from today moving forward to put it onto the compass of expectation that you must have had 2.5 years ago that made you say, no, I've had enough, I can't do this?
I think the first thing we would look for in terms of there being a positive change in Syria would be events on the ground. Would the Syrian government finally stop bombing civilian areas, whether it be suburban Damascus, whether it be Aleppo or Idlib or wherever it is? Would the Syrian government allow aid convoys to go through? If we could see positive changes on the ground, perhaps you could get a political negotiation underway, although it would be difficult. But I see no sign that the Syrian government is changing its position, with or without Russian pressure.
Okay, imagine for a second, for me, if you will, you are sitting down at a table with Sergei Lavrov, you're sitting down at the same table with John Kerry. The moderate rebels that a lot of this is predicated on have to have some form of representation at the table. What's the silver bullet? What's the phrase or the sentence that you say to Sergei Lavrov and John Kerry to say to those moderate rebels to get some sort of cessation of hostilities up and running?
Well, the key thing is that it has to be a mutually respected ceasefire, that there have to be mutual acceptance of the principle that humanitarian aid is not a political tool, it's not a pressure tool used against one side or the other. So that means the moderate rebels have to allow aid into besieged areas with government supporters, the towns of Fua and Nebula, for example. But on the other side, the Syrian government must also respect that. I think the American government has actually been making that argument. I just think it goes nowhere with the Russians and with the Syrians. The Russians themselves constantly defend the Syrian government, in private and in public. That's what your United Nations correspondent just at the start of the program was saying.
Mr. Ford, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us here on Al Jazeera. We really do appreciate your insight, sir.
My pleasure.